In a quiet Montana town, whispers travel faster than the wind. They say a Marine lives up by the ridge, a man with a haunted past, a wounded dog, and a woman who shouldn't be there. But when bullets cut through the snow, truth breaks free, and silence turns to courage. Don't miss what happens next. Like this story, and subscribe for more powerful tales of loyalty and redemption. The first snow of February hung on the pines like breath held too long, and the valley lay quiet under a thin blue morning. Luke Carter rose the way he always did in the hush before the day really started, letting the stove warm the room while coffee hissed in the dented percolator. The cabin was small, well-kept, everything in its place, boots turned heel to wall by the door, a folded wool blanket at the edge of a narrow bed, a radio that worked only when the weather allowed. Ranger, his German shepherd, lifted his head from the rug and thumped his tail twice the way he said, "Good morning," without making a sound. Luke scratched the old scar along Ranger's ear, a jagged mark that told more truth than any metal, and poured coffee into a chipped mug standing with the cup tucked in both hands, watching the line where timber met pasture. Montana did its own speaking. If a man knew how to listen, the swallow of wind in the gully, the faint crack of ice shifting on the creek, the slow wakefulness of light touching the far ridge. It had been a winter of quiet habits and simple work, the sort a man could build a life around when other lives had come and gone. He fed Ranger, checked the latch on the tool shed, spread grain for the couple of hens that bothered to lay through the cold, and brought in the mail from the metal box at the road. 2 farm supply circulars and a bill with his name typed neat as a sermon. The day promised nothing more than fence mending and diesel in the tractor, and Luke found comfort in the predictability, a rhythm as steady as Ranger's breathing beside him. They had made a covenant of sorts, man and dog, after the long deployments were done, and the noise of that other world refused to fade. Ranger understood the hours when Luke slept too shallow, and the times he needed to stand outside in the dark to remind himself of where he truly was, that the mountains were not dunes, that the silhouettes on his porch were pines, and not men. Ranger never insisted on talking about it. He simply kept watch, as if his eyes could hold the night still. By the time the sun climbed clear of the ridge, the sky had turned the hard kind of bright that makes a man squint. Luke slipped on gloves, set a coil of new wire in the bed of his truck, and called Ranger. The dog was already moving head low, body eager. They drove the short, rutted lane out to the north pasture, where a wind-bent cedar leaned against the fence like a drunk leaning on a friend, and Luke cut the cedar free, set the posts upright, and looped wire around them with a patient sort of efficiency. Winter had a way of making a man's thoughts tidy. He was thinking about whether the creek would hold through March when Ranger's body went still in that trained way. No bark, no whine, just an alertness like a string pulled tight. Then he broke from Luke's side and slipped into the trees, silent as a shadow. Luke waited, listening. A minute passed, maybe more. He heard only the creak, the faint rasp of wind, and the distant wing beat of a crow. When Ranger returned, he wasn't running. He carried something, mouth careful around it, his gait careful too. Luke set down the pliers and met the dog halfway, heart already tightening. It was a small backpack, pink nylon with a stitched flower on the pocket, the kind sold in the school aisle at the hardware store in town. Snow clung to it where Ranger had brushed through the low branches, and a darker wetness stained the bottom corner. Luke put a hand on Ranger's collar. "Easy," he said, because that was what a man said to himself too. He took the pack gently and felt the cold weight of it, the drag of damp through the glove. When he unzipped the top, he found a cracked plastic comb, a school folder with a name he didn't recognize, and a cloth coin purse. The stain on the bottom wasn't mud alone. It had dried rusty brown along the seam, a color Luke knew too well to pretend otherwise. Ranger looked from the pack to Luke, a soft sound in his throat, impatient and unsure, and somehow asking. Luke scanned the tree line and the winter-pale field beyond. tracks were a language out here. The snow carried records the wind could not quite erase deer-coyote the crisscross of hair. Closer to the trees, he saw a set of small prints, boot treads, no longer than his hand leading from the road to the fence and on toward the creek. They doubled back, wavered, then turned toward his land as if the maker had changed her mind at the last second. Luke followed them as far as the creek bank, where the ice shouldered along the edge, and the water moved in a narrow, whispering channel. Ranger pressed close, sniffing, circling, then lifting his head to taste the air. The prints faded where the wind had scoured the powder clean. Luke studied the direction of the last clear steps, then looked back toward the cabin. A man learns to trust the same instincts that have kept him alive. He called Ranger in and walked the long way home along the fence, eyes measuring distance, mind taking note of the world, the way he had been trained to approach lines cover fields of fire, a habit he wished he could unlearn as easily as folks wished he would. Back at the cabin, he set the backpack on the kitchen table and washed his hands at the sink, watching the cold water run clear. He turned the radio on low static, giving way to a farm report. He turned it off. The room felt smaller than it had an hour ago. Ranger paced once, twice. Then a sound came that wasn't the wind, wasn't the creek, wasn't the house settling. 3 quick taps on wood, not timid, so much as urgent and thin, like a pencil wrapping a desk. Luke opened the door and found a little girl standing on the top step, cheeks bright from cold breath fogging in the air. She held the severed strap from the pink backpack in both hands, fingers white around it. Her hat was knitted the style you buy in a hurry at the gas station rack. It sat crooked on her head. She had the look of a child who hadn't slept not truly in some time. Ranger came to the threshold and stopped, head tilted, ears forward, tail low. The girl's eyes flicked to the dog and then back to Luke's face. People always noticed his size, first broad shoulders, a jaw that looked stubborn, even when he was just thinking, but the girl didn't step back. Something in her had already decided. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and careful, every word balanced like it might break if she hurried. Mama said the Marine would help. The words painted a line between them, straight and clear. Luke nodded once because it felt like a promise was the only answer. He moved aside, a hand smoothing the air at Ranger's shoulder. "It's all right," he said, and realized he was speaking to both of them. The girl stepped in, and Ranger did something he did only on rare certain days. He lowered himself to the floor and inched forward on his elbows, offering his presence without crowding her, a soldier making himself small so the frightened could breathe. She reached a hand toward him and touched the rough fur along his neck, and her mouth trembled the tiniest bit like a knot being untied. Luke hung his coat on the peg, took a towel from the stove rail and handed it to her. "Let's get you warm," he said. "I'm Luke. This is Ranger." She looked down at the strap, as if remembering it for the first time, then up at the table where the backpack lay like a question. "I'm Lily," she said. "Mama told me to find you." Luke felt the room tilt, not in panic, but in the way a life bends when the road you thought you were on turns and you understand you must follow. He put a pan on for soup. He asked only what he had to. "Is your mother close?" The girl swallowed. "Home," she said. "She told me to run." Ranger lifted his head at the word run, a muscle jumping in his jaw. Luke studied Lily's boots, too small, thin-soled, the lace on one frayed near through, and the chill in her hands even after the towel. He shrugged into his coat and knelt to Lily's height so his eyes met hers and his voice could be something steady in the suddenness of her world. "You did the right thing," he said. "We'll go to her." He looked at Ranger, and the dog was already rising ready. Luke checked the rifle behind the door and left it where it was. This was not a moment for a weapon. It was a moment for speed and for the kind of judgment no barrel could provide. He grabbed a wool blanket, tucked it around Lily's shoulders. set the pink backpack in her hands as if returning part of her life to her. She clutched it, and a kind of resolve settled over her face, the kind children wear when they realize they must be brave enough for two. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying a taste of iron snow. Luke locked the door out of habit, then unlocked it again. A small, inexplicable thing, he corrected without thinking, and they walked to the truck. Luke's hand on the cab. Lily's boots, careful on the step. Ranger springing lightly into the back as if the years had never weighted him. The engine coughed, caught, and gave its familiar low hum. As Luke turned the wheel toward the county road, he felt the day shift out from under him. He didn't know yet that there would be a long night ahead, a town watching a choice between fight and something harder. All he knew was the map in his head, the feel of Ranger's gaze on the fields, the presence of a little girl who had found his door and spoken the one sentence that could pull a man out of his quiet life. The truck rolled onto the thin ribbon of asphalt, and the valley opened before them, bare and bright, and full of the kind of trouble that tests a man's measure. Luke reached over without looking and spread the blanket tighter around Lily. "Tell me how to get there," he said. She pointed down the road with her chin the way people do when they're scared of spilling anything else, and Ranger's ears turned to the same angle, already charting the distance as if he could will them quicker. Above the wheel, Luke's knuckles whitened, then eased. He wasn't sure what waited at the end of that turn, but he knew the shape of duty when it stepped onto his porch and asked to be let in. The road ran narrow between the frozen fields, a gray ribbon through the white silence of the valley. Luke Carter drove carefully, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near the heater vent to keep his fingers from going stiff. Beside him, Lily sat small beneath the wool blanket, watching the snow-laced barbed wire slide past her window. Ranger rode in the back seat, his head near the glass nose, working the air with restless focus, as though each passing mile carried a scent he recognized but couldn't yet name. Luke kept his eyes forward. The quiet between him and the child wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy, like the world had asked both of them to think before speaking. After a few miles, he asked softly, "You're Mama Grace, right?" "Grace." "Turner?" Lily nodded once. "She works in town at the diner by the Veterans Hall." The words landed slow, carrying a faint warmth of memory. Luke had been there once or twice after leaving the service, sitting alone near the window while others from his unit talked too loud about old stories. He remembered a waitress with gentle hands, a woman who kept her eyes down but somehow knew when to refill a man's cup without asking. There had been a box of letters, too, from a stranger signing only as a friend from home. Simple notes about Montana weather, harvests, how the stars looked over the ridge in winter. They had come during his last deployment when his platoon was pinned for weeks in a place that forgot what mercy meant. Those letters had been the one quiet corner of hope he could still touch. Now, with the sound of the truck's engine and the faint rasp of snow beneath the tires, he felt that same voice echo through time, joining the present like a thread drawn tight. He looked at Lily and saw the same shape of chin, the same gray-green eyes. It struck him then, not like surprise, but like recognition finally allowed to breathe, that Grace Turner and the unseen writer were one and the same. He didn't say it out loud. Some truths, when spoken too soon, lose their gentleness. The road curved toward the low hills where the Turner's place sat half a mile off the main route. Lily pointed through the windshield. "That way," she said, her voice hoarse from the cold. Luke nodded, downshifting as they hit the incline. The truck's tires slipped once before catching. The sky had turned the color of tarnished silver, and the light stretched long shadows across the snow. Ranger growled low, not with threat, but with alertness, the kind that meant something ahead felt wrong. Luke slowed to a crawl, scanning the tree line. The Turner house came into view, a small one-story structure with a sagging porch smoke gone cold in the chimney. The front door cracked open enough for the wind to toy with the hinge. The drifts along the steps showed only one set of footprints leading in and not out. Luke cut the engine. "Stay in the truck," he said gently to Lily. She hesitated, eyes wide, clutching the blanket closer. Ranger Luke murmured, and the dog sprang out, landing soft in the snow, every muscle tight with attention. Luke followed, the crunch of his boots sounding loud in the still air. When he pushed the door open, the smell hit first something acrid, a mix of spilled whiskey, cold ash, and the faint copper tang that didn't belong in any peaceful home. The room was dim curtains drawn, though the day outside was bright. A chair lay overturned, a picture frame shattered beside it. Ranger moved ahead, muzzle close to the floor, his nails ticking against the worn boards. Luke's throat went dry. "Grace," he called quietly. A sound answered, faint and fragile from the back room, a breath more than a word. Luke stepped over the broken frame, eyes scanning as his training returned in quiet, disciplined corners, exit signs of struggle. In the narrow hallway, the wallpaper peeled where a fist had struck it hard enough to dent the plaster beneath. Ranger nosed the bedroom door open with his shoulder. Grace Turner lay on the floor beside the bed. Her face pale, one cheek swollen, a dark bruise spreading along her temple. Her hand twitched when Ranger whined softly beside her, the deep, worried sound of a dog trying to comfort without touching. Luke knelt quickly, fingers at her neck. The pulse was there, weak but steady. He pulled the quilt from the bed and wrapped it around her shoulders, speaking low, not for comfort, but to keep her tethered to the moment. "Grace, it's Luke Carter. You're safe now." Her eyelids fluttered. Recognition flickered through pain. "Luke." From the hall, she murmured, voice frayed. "Lily. She's in the truck." "She's fine," he said. "Don't try to move." He glanced around, taking in the overturned lamp, the shattered glass near the door, the pattern of chaos that spoke of anger, not theft. Ranger circled once, hackles still raised, nose pressed toward the back of the house. Luke followed his gaze and saw the back door swinging slightly, a half print of a man's boot stamped into the snow outside. The tread was fresh enough to hold its shape. Whoever had done this had left in a hurry, but not long ago. Luke eased Grace onto the bed, tucking the quilt tighter. Her eyes blinked open again. "He said he'd come back," she whispered. "Dean." He said nobody would stop him. Luke's jaw tightened. He looked to Ranger, who stood at the threshold, muscles coiled ready. "He's gone for now," Luke said quietly. "But we'll take you somewhere safe." Grace tried to sit, winced, and caught his sleeve instead. "They'll talk," she said. "They always do." Luke met her gaze. "Let them." He checked the dresser drawers for anything she might need, clothes, a coat, an envelope of money tucked behind a drawer bottom. He found a framed photograph turned face down. Grace, a smiling man, and a little girl no older than Lily at 3. He set it upright again, face grim, and slipped it into his coat pocket without a word. From outside came the faint cry of a child's voice, Lily calling for her mother. Luke moved to the door and signaled Ranger to follow. The dog's head turned sharply toward the road. Snow drifted up in the wind, and for a moment Luke thought he saw movement far off near the tree line, a figure on foot, heavy coat, walking fast. Then it was gone behind the hill. He didn't chase. The wounded come first. He carried Grace through the doorway, one arm under her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, her weight light as if half her spirit had already gone somewhere else. Lily ran to them, her blanket falling away, and Ranger brushed against her, blocking the wind. Luke laid Grace carefully across the truck's seat, wrapping her again in the wool. "We'll get her warm," he said. Lily climbed in beside her, taking her mother's hand. Grace's fingers squeezed faintly enough to let Luke know she was still fighting to stay in the world. He started the engine, turning the truck toward the distant glow of the valley. Ranger settled in the back, head high, eyes fixed on the rear mirror like a soldier guarding the retreat. Luke didn't look back at the house until the turn took it from sight. The chimney stood dark, the door still open, the cold claiming it inch by inch. He reached forward, adjusted the heater toward Grace and Lily, and said quietly, "We'll be home soon." The word home meant something different now, but he let it stand. The snow fell thicker as they drove, covering the past for a little while, though not for long. The snow carried them back to the cabin like a slow tide pulling toward safety, though Luke Carter knew safety was a temporary word in a world that loved to whisper. The heater hummed low, filling the truck with a faint warmth as Grace Turner drifted in and out of shallow sleep, her head resting against the window, her bruised cheek turned from the light. Lily held her mother's hand, small fingers clenched in steady devotion, whispering every now and then to reassure herself that Grace still breathed. Ranger sat upright in the back, his muzzle near the glass eyes fixed on the empty road behind them, guarding what little peace the night allowed. When they reached the cabin, the valley had turned silent again. Luke parked near the porch, the truck engine ticking as it cooled and stepped out into air that smelled of pine and smoke. He opened the door, lifted Grace gently, and carried her inside his boots, leaving heavy prints that filled quickly with wind-blown snow. The room met them with firelight and quiet. Lily followed, clutching her mother's scarf, while Ranger circled once, inspecting the perimeter of the single-room cabin before lying near the door, head-up ears listening to every shift of wind outside. Luke laid Grace on the narrow bed, adjusting the quilt beneath her shoulders. His movements careful but efficient, the way a man acts when emotion must wait its turn. He checked her pulse again, found it stronger than before, and poured a little warm water over a cloth to clean the cut at her temple. Grace stirred faintly, eyes opening for a moment, confusion softening into recognition. "You shouldn't have," she whispered, voice raw. "The town will talk." Luke met her gaze, his tone steady. "Let them." He turned to Lily and nodded toward the table. "Heat her some soup. She needs it more than sleep." The child obeyed without a word, moving with a quiet maturity that belonged to those who have seen too much too early. The smell of broth filled the small space, and for the first time in a long while, the sound of a spoon tapping against tin carried a kind of fragile hope. Luke sat near the fire boots unlaced, watching the snow drift past the window. Ranger shifted closer to Lily's pallet when the girl lay down, pressing his side against her arm, until her breathing slowed and evened. The dog did not close his eyes. He watched the door as if waiting for something to come through it. Outside, the wind rose and fell, brushing snow against the window panes in soft rhythms. Inside, time thinned itself into the steady crackle of fire and the slow breathing of 3 people learning how to rest again. By morning, the cabin smelled of coffee and damp wool. Grace woke first, sitting up carefully, one hand pressed to her ribs. Her face carried the fading marks of the night before, but the color had returned to her lips. Luke handed her a mug of water and said nothing while she drank. He stepped outside to feed the chickens and check the truck, Ranger trotting at his heel-tail high but cautious. The sky was pale and wide, the kind of clear that made every color sharper, every sound louder. He reached the truck and stopped. Across the driver's door, bright red paint screamed against the dull metal, the letters jagged and uneven as though written by a hand shaking with anger, thief of another man's wife. The words cut across the frost like an accusation carved in blood. Luke stood still for a long moment. Ranger sniffed the air nose close to the paint, then sneezed sharply, a low growl building in his chest. The scent was fresh solvent and rage and something human behind it. Luke ran a thumb along the bottom edge of one letter, the paint still tacky. Someone had been here before dawn, bold enough to walk his land, but too cowardly to face him. He glanced toward the road, noting faint tire tracks leading back to town. Without speaking, he turned and walked to the shed, pulling out a rag and a tin of kerosene. He scrubbed at the letters until the color blurred into a dull smear, though no amount of effort could erase what they meant. Ranger barked once, the sound sharp in the morning air, then looked toward the ridge where the tracks disappeared. Easy, Luke said quietly. They'll show themselves soon enough. He filled a bucket with water and poured it over the door, the red washing down into the snow like a stain sinking into memory. When he returned inside, Grace was at the table trying to braid Lily's hair with hands that still trembled. She looked up, saw the tension in his face, and seemed to understand without asking. They won't stop, she said softly. Luke shrugged into his coat, his voice even. Neither will I. He poured her another cup of coffee, set it before her, and knelt beside Ranger to check the dog's collar, the small gesture of grounding himself through habit. Lily came to stand beside him, resting her hand on Ranger's back. Is someone mad at you? She asked, eyes uncertain. Luke hesitated, choosing words that wouldn't frighten her. Some people don't understand kindness when they see it, he said. But that's not our worry today. He turned to Grace. You'll stay here until you can stand steady again. After that, we'll see what's next. Grace opened her mouth as if to protest, then closed it. Her eyes shone briefly in the firelight, not with tears, but with the quiet exhaustion of a woman who has spent too many years bracing for harm. She reached for his hand, not to hold it, but to steady herself. You don't owe us this, she whispered. Luke looked down at her, then at Lily, who had crouched beside Ranger, whispering something into the dog's ear. Maybe I do, he said simply, though even he wasn't sure whether he meant it as duty or redemption. As the day wore on, the valley thawed slightly under a weak sun. Luke worked outside, chopping wood, checking the roof every so often, glancing toward the road. Each strike of the axe was clean measured and purposeful. Inside, Grace mended a tear in the curtain, her fingers remembering old skills while Lily drew quietly by the stove, sketching Ranger asleep by the door. The world for the briefest moment felt almost normal. But as dusk fell, a truck slowed on the road beyond the fence, its engine idling too long before moving on. Luke's hand stilled on the axe handle. Ranger lifted his head, growled once, then settled again when the sound faded. Grace came to the doorway, her shawl pulled tight, her expression unreadable. Luke said nothing. They both knew the storm they had brought into his life would not stay at bay forever. When night came, he secured the windows and checked the rifle by habit, then sat near the fire until Ranger rose, stretched, and settled beside Lily again, the dog's great head resting near the child's small hand. Luke watched them a long time, the fire casting their shadows together on the log walls, a soldier, a dog, a mother, and a child, forming the smallest, most fragile shape of family against the dark. He did not call it that, not yet, but the word lived unspoken in the air. Outside, somewhere past the line of trees, the world waited to test it. The wind pressed against the cabin walls with a low, steady moan that night, the kind of sound that stretched through a man's dreams until he could no longer tell what was wind and what was memory. Luke Carter slept lightly as he always did, the rifle propped near the door, the wood stove humming a faint glow of orange. Grace Turner and Lily lay in the bed behind the curtain he had strung to give them privacy, their breaths soft and even. Ranger lay between the bed and the hearth paws, twitching, as he dreamed perhaps of the same deserts that haunted his master. The clock on the mantel ticked past midnight, each second falling like a pebble into deep water. Luke's dream began, as it always did, with sunlight too bright and sky too wide, the crack of rifles echoing across sand that burned like fire. He heard his sergeant's voice calling orders, felt the weight of dust clog his throat, the vibration of distant explosions shaking through his bones. He turned, saw the flash of light that always came next, and then the noise swallowed him whole. The dream folded in on itself, the sound of gunfire merging with the rhythmic thud of his own heart, and suddenly he was back there. Heat, chaos, shouting, and the instinct to survive clawed its way to the surface. His hand reached for the rifle beside his bed muscles, moving before reason could stop them. Ranger's head shot up, ears pricked, body tense in the half-dark. The dog recognized the shift before Luke did. The sound of breath too quick, the whispered word that wasn't meant for this place. Luke's fingers brushed the metal stock cold and real, but before he could pull it closer, Ranger lunged. The dog's weight hit his arm, knocking the weapon aside with a clatter. The sudden noise broke the dream's hold, but confusion flooded in its place. Luke struggled against the darkness, half awake, half lost, gasping as if the air had turned to sand again. Ranger pressed his chest against Luke's, using his own weight to pin him down, eyes wide, tail low, a low rumble deep in his throat, not of threat, but of command. The sound said, "Stop, breathe. You're safe." Luke's body obeyed before his mind could. He froze, eyes wide open, the firelight painting shadows across the ceiling like the sweep of helicopter blades. In the small bed, Lily stirred at the noise sitting upright beneath the blanket. Her heart raced in her chest as she peered over the quilt. Seeing the large man on the floor, the dog over him, the rifle knocked against the wall. For a moment she thought another fight had begun, but then she saw Ranger's eyes focused, steady, calm, and she knew somehow that this was not danger but something different, something wounded and old. She slipped quietly from the bed, her bare feet light on the wood floor, and crouched near them. Luke's breathing came in ragged pulls, his hands trembling against the floorboards, sweat shining on his face despite the chill. Lily hesitated, fear warring with empathy, then whispered softly, "It's okay. You're home now." Her voice, small and certain, reached through the haze of memory like a thread. Ranger shifted, resting his head on Luke's chest, the full weight of him grounding the man beneath him, the warmth of his body anchoring him in the present. Luke blinked the blur, fading the cabin, returning piece by piece, the smell of smoke, the glow of embers, the soft crackle that meant he was not in the desert anymore. His gaze found Lily's face pale in the dim light, eyes wide but not afraid. The sight steadied him more than the dog's strength ever could. He closed his hand slowly, letting the tension drain from his fingers, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Grace stirred at the sound, pushing back the curtain. Her voice was hoarse with sleep and concern. "Luke," she asked quietly. He nodded, still catching his breath. "Just a bad dream," he said. She studied him for a moment, understanding flickering behind her tired eyes. "You and that dog saved each other," she murmured almost to herself before drawing the curtain closed again to let him recover. Luke sat up, leaning against the wall, one hand resting on Ranger's back. The dog stayed pressed close, unwilling to move until the tremors fully stopped. Lily sat cross-legged beside them, watching the fire as if guarding it from fading. "You used to fight, didn't you?" she asked in a whisper. Luke looked at her, unsure how much truth a child should hear. "A long time ago," he said, finally. "I fought to come home." She nodded, accepting that as enough. "Mama says people fight for what they love," she said, and then added softer, "She says sometimes it hurts even when you win." Luke considered that the weight of her words surprising him. "Your mama's right," he said. "It always hurts a little." The room settled again into quiet. Lily returned to bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and within minutes her breathing slowed back to sleep. Ranger moved to his usual spot near the hearth, but kept one eye open, his ears twitching at every gust of wind. Luke sat awake for a long while, staring into the fire. The old memories still hovered at the edge of sight, the sand, the noise, the flash of a friend's face just before it vanished, but they no longer had the same power. He owed that to a dog and a child who had both learned in their own ways to trust him. When the first hint of dawn brushed the window, he rose quietly, fed the fire another log, and stepped outside. The air was brittle and sharp, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from distant farms. The mountains stood pale and solemn against the morning sky. He drew a long breath, the cold biting his lungs, and for once it felt good just to feel. Behind him, the cabin glowed faintly in the half-light, a single lantern flickering inside like a heartbeat. As the sun rose, Luke walked the perimeter of the property, checking fences and tracks. He saw nothing unusual, but the world seemed changed, somehow less a place of isolation, more a place that required guarding. When he returned, Ranger met him at the door, tail wagging, slow eyes steady. Luke scratched the dog's ear. "Good boy," he said the words, carrying gratitude heavier than praise. Inside, Grace was stirring oatmeal at the stove while Lily set the table with mismatched cups. They greeted him with quiet smiles, as if the night had folded itself away neatly behind them. For a moment, Luke let himself believe it could stay that way. Yet he knew peace like this was fragile. He had lived long enough to recognize how quickly it could shatter. He glanced toward the road, the faint tracks of a vehicle from days past still etched in the snow. The town was not far, and whispers traveled faster than any storm. He closed the door, deciding to let one more day of quiet pass before he went down to face them. Ranger lay at his feet, tail sweeping once-twice in rhythm with his breathing. The fire caught, throwing light across the walls, chasing the shadows back where they belonged. Sunday arrived beneath a pale sky, the kind that offered no warmth even when the sun finally showed its face. Luke Carter had shaved a habit he had nearly forgotten, and he wore his cleanest flannel under the old Marine jacket, folded sharp at the cuffs. Grace Turner hesitated by the door, one hand holding Lily's shoulder, the other clutching her worn shawl as though it were a shield. Luke turned toward her. "You don't have to go," he said quietly. Grace shook her head. "People will talk more if we hide." He understood. The only way through a whisper was to face it. Ranger trotted between them, tail low, his breath visible in the cold as they stepped out to the truck. The drive into town took 15 minutes, long enough for Grace's hands to twist the edge of her shawl into knots. Luke kept his eyes on the road, the sound of the tires over frozen ruts, the only rhythm they could share. When the church steeple rose above the snowfield, the bell began to toll its sound, scattering crows from the trees. Inside the small wooden church, the stove burned bright, but the warmth did not reach the stairs. Luke guided Grace and Lily to a pew near the back. Heads turned as the three entered, first out of habit, then out of recognition. Conversations softened to murmurs, then to silence. The minister's voice faltered mid-sentence before finding its footing again. Grace kept her eyes down, folding her hands over the hymn book. Lily sat between her and Luke, small and still, her boots swinging above the floor. Ranger waited outside, tied near the hitching post, a faint bark now and then breaking through the hymns. Luke focused on the stained glass window above the altar light, shifting in slow colors across the pastor's hands. He had seen judgment before in briefing rooms and battlefields, in the faces of men weighing life and death, but the quiet kind found in church was harder to endure. After the service, the congregation spilled out into the brittle air. Mrs. Callahan, one of the older women, approached Grace with a smile too polished to be kind. "My dear," she said, "it must be such a comfort to have a good man nearby, though of course folks are beginning to wonder when your husband will come to his senses." Grace flinched as if struck, then managed a small nod. Luke stepped forward, his shadow falling between them, his tone calm. "Mrs. Callahan, the ladies had enough for one morning." The woman's mouth pressed into a thin line, but she turned away, her eyes sharp as ice. Sheriff Mason stood by the steps, his hat in his hands, watching the exchange. When the crowd began to drift toward the road, he approached Luke, lowering his voice. "Luke, people are starting to talk. They think Grace should go back to her husband." Luke's jaw tightened. "And what do you think?" Mason sighed. "I think you've got a good heart, but hearts don't quiet gossip. Dean's been in town stirring folks. I'd keep an eye out." Luke nodded, his expression unreadable. "Appreciate the warning." They rode home in silence, the snow beginning again, light as ash. Grace stared out the window, her reflection faint against the glass. "They'll never see us as anything but wrong," she said finally. "You saved us, and somehow that's the sin." Luke kept his hand steady on the wheel. "People see what they need to," he said. "We'll let truth take its time." Ranger leaned forward from the back seat, pressing his nose between them, breaking the heaviness for a moment. Lily reached to scratch his muzzle, her touch gentle, her laughter small but real. The sound eased something inside Luke that he hadn't known was still tense. By nightfall, lights from town glimmered faintly on the horizon. In the saloon near Main Street, voices grew louder as the bottles emptied. Dean Walker had returned 2 days ago, wearing his pride like armor and nursing his anger like a wound. He told anyone who would listen that his wife had been stolen, his daughter hidden away. Each telling grew larger, fed by drink and the hunger of those who craved other people's stories. When the sheriff passed by the window, he caught the shape of Dean's arm slamming against the bar and decided to keep walking. Nothing he said tonight would matter tomorrow. Inside, Dean stood over a small crowd. "That Marine thinks he can take what's mine," he shouted. "He hides behind his dog behind that cabin like a coward." A few men laughed uneasily while others looked away. Dean picked up a framed photograph that hung on the wall near the piano, an old picture of the local veterans. Luke among them, his uniform crisp, his face calm. Without warning, Dean hurled it to the floor. The glass shattered, the sound slicing through the room. "There's your hero," he said, voice shaking not with triumph, but with the unsteady pitch of a man who knows his own lies. The barkeep, a thin man named Ellis, leaned across the counter. "Dean, you'd best cool down before this turns ugly." Dean's glare softened to a sneer. "You'll see," he muttered, "he can't hide forever." The crowd split, half murmuring support, half stepping back into silence. The broken glass glittered on the floor, a reflection of the light that caught on every uneasy face. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Luke stood outside beneath the porch roof, watching the snow gather on Ranger's fur. Grace had gone to bed early, Lily asleep beside her, both exhausted by the weight of public eyes. Ranger rested near Luke's boot's tail, flicking against the boards. "They won't stop talking," Luke said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. Ranger lifted his head, his breath forming small clouds that vanished into the night. The sound of the distant wind carried a hint of town noise, faint music from the saloon, a shout, maybe laughter. Luke felt the pull of it, the old familiar instinct to step toward conflict, but he forced his hands to stay at his sides. He looked at the window where the lamplight touched Grace's sleeping face, then back toward the horizon. "We'll let them have their noise," he said. "We'll keep our peace." Ranger made a low sound as if agreeing, but peace was never a lasting thing. The next morning, Sheriff Mason arrived early, his truck tires crunching the snow. He leaned against the porch rail, speaking softly. "Dean made a mess in town last night. He's telling folks you've got his family up here against their will." Luke didn't answer. Mason studied him, his tone almost apologetic. "I'll keep the law between you and him, but Luke, the town's patience is thin. Be careful." When the sheriff drove off, Luke looked down the road, the tracks fading behind the truck. He knew what was coming. Ranger stepped forward, nose testing the cold air body alert. Luke reached down and scratched behind his ear. "Stay close," he said. "It's going to get louder before it gets quiet again." The snow began to fall harder, each flake landing without a sound, covering everything except the truth waiting to be faced. The day after the sheriff's warning, the sky hung low and gray, and the air carried that uneasy stillness that often comes before trouble. Luke Carter spent the morning splitting logs behind the cabin, the steady rhythm of the axe, a way to keep his thoughts in order. Each swing struck the wood clean, and the sound echoed through the trees like a metronome marking time for the inevitable. Ranger lay nearby, watching the road that wound down toward town. Grace Turner was inside tending to chores she had invented to keep her hands busy, while Lily read softly to herself by the fire, her small voice blending with the crackle of flame. The ordinary sounds of the morning were almost enough to convince Luke that peace might still be possible. But by early afternoon, the stillness broke. Ranger's ears twitched first, the fur along his neck rising in a slow ripple. Luke paused axe mid-air and listened. A truck engine growled somewhere down the lane, growing louder, then slowed to a stop near the fence. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and something sharper, cheap whiskey carried on cold wind. Luke set the axe aside and wiped his palms on his flannel, his posture calm but ready. He walked to the front yard, Ranger pacing at his side. A rusted pickup idled near the gate, the driver's door open. Dean Walker stepped out, shoulders squared, jaw tight beneath a day's worth of stubble. His eyes were glassy, not with drink alone, but with wounded pride that had nowhere left to go. He looked at Luke, then at the cabin, then back again. "She's still here, isn't she?" Dean said, his voice rough. "You think hiding her makes her yours?" Luke didn't answer right away. He studied the man before him, the unsteady stance, the hands that kept clenching and unclenching, the pain twisting beneath the anger. Ranger stood rigid, silent, his gaze fixed. "Dean," Luke said, finally, his tone even the war's over. "Don't start another one you can't win." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy. Dean laughed, once a short, hollow sound. "You think this is war? This is my family." He took a step forward, but Ranger shifted instantly, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Dean froze, glancing at the dog's bared teeth. Luke's voice stayed calm. "You're not walking through that gate. Go home before you make something you can't undo." For a long moment the two men stood in the cold breath fogging between them, one held by pride, the other by restraint. Then Dean spat toward the snow and turned away, muttering something too quiet to catch. The truck engine roared as he climbed in and spun back toward the road tires, spitting slush. Luke watched until the sound faded completely, then exhaled. Ranger relaxed only when Luke laid a hand on his shoulder. "Good boy," he murmured. "He'll be back, but not today." That evening the wind carried the bite of new weather. Clouds moved fast across the mountains, dragging the light with them. Inside, Grace sensed the shift in Luke's silence. She tried to speak, perhaps to thank him, perhaps to warn him, but he shook his head gently. "It's fine. He said he just needed to see where the line is." Grace turned back to the stove, her hands trembling slightly. Lily sat at the table, coloring quietly, unaware of the storm her family had stirred. When supper ended, Luke checked the doors, the latches, the rifle near his bed. He had learned long ago that peace was best guarded in silence. Night came quickly, heavy and cold. Ranger settled by the hearth, but did not sleep deeply. Each creak of the cabin made his ears twitch. Luke sat in the chair by the window, the firelight painting half his face in gold, the other half in shadow. He thought of the wars he had already fought, the promises he had broken, and kept the letters from a woman he hadn't realized he already knew. He thought of Dean's eyes, the same fear that every angry man carries when the world begins to slip beyond his control. The clock ticked toward midnight. Grace and Lily slept behind the curtain, their breathing steady. Ranger lifted his head once, sniffed the air, then lay it back down. One paw stretched toward Luke's boots. The night seemed to settle again, but the peace was deceptive. The first bullet came with no warning, a sharp crack that split the quiet. The sound of glass and wood followed an instant later as the porch post splintered near the door. Luke dropped from the chair before thought could form. Ranger leapt across the room in the same motion, knocking Luke down just as the second shot tore through the window pane, scattering shards across the floor. The dog's weight drove the air from Luke's lungs, but it also kept him alive. Ranger barked once, fierce and deep, the sound echoing like thunder in the small cabin. Grace screamed from the back, pulling Lily from the bed. Down. Luke shouted, his voice low but sharp. He crawled toward the wall, peering through the shattered glass. The snow outside glowed faintly under the moon, but no movement showed, only the whisper of wind through the pines. Whoever fired was gone or hiding beyond sight. Luke rose slowly, rifle in hand, body low. Ranger pressed against his leg, growl, steady eyes searching the dark. Another gust of wind swept snow through the broken window, scattering ash from the hearth across the floor, like dust from some forgotten battlefield. Luke's heartbeat slowed from its furious pace as training settled back into him, the same calm he had once used to survive places far worse than this. He checked the porch, then circled to the back door, every step measured. Nothing. Only the tracks of a single vehicle leading back toward the road. The shooter had made his point and fled. Luke returned inside, setting the rifle down, his expression unreadable. Grace stood by the bed, clutching Lily close. "Was it him?" she asked, voice shaking. "Probably," Luke said quietly. "He wanted to scare us. He nearly did." Ranger moved to Luke's side again, licking his hand once before sitting, chest heaving from adrenaline. Luke reached down, fingers brushing the fur between the dog's ears. "You saved me," he said softly. Ranger tilted his head as if confused by the praise. Luke turned to Grace. "We'll stay alert. Tomorrow I'll go to town. Mason needs to hear about this before it gets worse." Grace nodded, tears sliding down her face unnoticed. Lily peeked out from her mother's arms, her voice barely a whisper. "Is he coming back?" Luke hesitated. "If he does, he said he won't find us unprepared." As dawn crept pale over the mountains, the cabin looked unchanged from the outside, but inside everything had shifted. The porch post bore a hole the width of a finger. The glass lay in glittering fragments beneath the window, and the air itself carried a residue of danger. Luke brewed coffee he didn't drink and stared through the hole toward the road, waiting for the first sound of an engine. Ranger lay beside his boots, eyes half closed but alert to every noise. When the sheriff's truck finally appeared on the horizon, Luke didn't move. He simply said, "It's starting," and Ranger, as if understanding, rose and stood beside him. The storm began before dusk, rolling down from the mountains with the weight of something ancient and unforgiving. Snow fell thick as smoke, erasing fences, fields, and the thin line between road and sky. Luke Carter nailed the shutters tight and checked the latch on every door, while Grace Turner gathered blankets for Lily, who sat by the fire hugging her knees. Ranger paced restlessly near the window, tail stiff, ears twitching toward the dark beyond the glass. The memory of the gunfire still clung to them like a second skin, and even the fire's warmth could not chase it away. Luke sensed the unease in the dog, the restless energy that often came before something unseen. "Easy, boy," he said quietly, but Ranger's eyes stayed fixed on the storm. When the wind began to howl through the pines, it sounded like voices calling across distance. Grace touched Luke's arm. "He's out there, isn't he?" she asked softly. "Dean doesn't scare that easy." Luke looked toward the window, the snow swirling in the lamplight like ash. "If he's out there, this storm will make him think twice," he said. But the words felt hollow even to him. Ranger whined once low in his throat, then moved toward the door. Luke caught his collar, but the dog's muscles were tense, his gaze locked on something outside. For a moment, Luke thought it was the wind stirring the fence, but then he saw it. A dark figure moving at the edge of the yard, gone the instant he blinked. Ranger barked once, sharp and certain, then slipped from Luke's grasp. Before anyone could stop him, he pushed through the crack of the door and vanished into the storm. Ranger Luke called, his voice swallowed by the wind. The snow closed around the cabin, muffling sound until only the fire's crackle remained. Lily ran to the door, tears bright on her cheeks. "He'll come back," Luke said, though doubt pressed heavy against his ribs. Hours passed. Grace held Lily close by the fire, humming softly to calm her. The child's sobs quieted, and she drifted into uneasy sleep, whispering the dog's name as though it might guide him home. Luke stood by the window, watching for any sign, his breath fogging the glass. He told himself Ranger was trained, that the dog could find his way through worse, but the storm showed no mercy. Near midnight, he lit the lantern, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. Grace tried to stop him, but he shook his head. "He saved me once," he said. "I'm not letting him die out there." The snow was waist-deep, the wind cutting across his face like shards of glass. Luke moved by instinct, head low, eyes scanning the ground for tracks. He found them near the fence line, deep prints pressed into the fresh snow, a trail leading away from the cabin and down toward the old creek road. Among them were smaller indentations, the kind left by boots, heavy and staggered. Luke knelt, brushing the snow away with his glove, and saw a faint smear of red against white. His stomach clenched. He followed step by step through the darkness, the lantern's flame bending in the wind. The trail led him across the frozen creek and up toward the Walker property, where the barn's silhouette loomed against the storm like a black tooth in the mouth of the night. The doors were half open, snow drifting in. Luke raised the lantern light, spilling across the hay-strewn floor. At first he saw nothing but shadows. Then, near the far stall, a shape moved, slow, deliberate. "Ranger," he whispered. The dog lifted his head, eyes reflecting the light. Blood matted the fur along his shoulder, the color almost black in the dim glow. He tried to stand, but stumbled, his breath coming in short bursts. Luke was at his side in seconds, kneeling in the straw, setting the lantern down beside them. "Easy, boy," he said, pressing a hand to the wound. The blood was sticky but not fresh. The bullet had grazed rather than pierced. Ranger's body trembled with exhaustion, yet his eyes burned with purpose. Luke followed the dog's gaze to the corner of the stall where a tarp lay half covered by straw. Beneath it, the faint outline of crates. He pulled the tarp back, revealing the gleam of metal rifles stacked and wrapped in oilcloth. A cache hidden from the law enough to arm a dozen men. Dean's voice echoed in Luke's memory, the drunken talk of friends who knew how to settle things. Now the truth was laid bare. Ranger shifted, pushing something with his nose toward Luke's hand. It was Lily's old scarf, the one she had tied around Ranger's neck days ago. The fabric was torn, crusted with snow and dirt. Luke realized the dog had carried it with him, used it as scent to track the danger. "You found it?" Luke whispered, his voice rough with both pride and anger. Ranger laid his head on Luke's knee, eyes half closed but still alert, as though trying to say, "This is what you needed to see." Luke pressed a hand against his fur. "You did good, soldier," he said. He tore a strip from his undershirt, bound the wound as best he could, and lifted Ranger into his arms. The dog was heavier than he remembered, his warmth seeping through Luke's coat. Outside, the wind screamed through the cracks of the barn, and Luke knew they had little time. If Dean or his men returned the evidence, and their lives would both be lost. He carried Ranger through the storm, each step sinking deep into snow. The lantern swung from his wrist, light flickering across the white expanse. The wind roared louder, erasing his tracks almost as fast as he made them. When he finally reached the cabin, his arms shook from effort. Grace threw open the door, relief and fear colliding in her face. "Is he?" she began, but Luke only nodded. "He'll live." He laid Ranger by the fire, and Lily woke at the sound rushing to the dog's side. Ranger's tail thumped weakly against the floor, and Lily pressed her cheek to his head, whispering thanks through her tears. Luke stood back watching them, the exhaustion in his bones replaced by something sharper certainty. He knew now what Dean was hiding, what kind of men he had drawn into his anger. The rifles meant more than pride, they meant danger for everyone in this valley. Luke turned toward the window, snow still falling hard outside. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "this goes to the sheriff." Grace looked up, fear flickering in her eyes. "If you do that, Dean will come for you." Luke nodded. Then, Let him." Ranger stirred at the sound of his voice, his tail brushing the floor once more before sleep claimed him. The storm began to ease, the wind dying down, leaving behind a silence that was almost peaceful. Luke poured himself a cup of coffee, gone cold, staring into the fire. He had found more than proof of crime. He had found the line he could no longer avoid crossing. Outside, the snow buried the tracks leading back to Dean's farm, but the truth waited beneath, impossible to erase. By morning, the storm had thinned to a hush. The sky, a pale wash of silver, stretched over the valley. Luke Carter stood on the porch of his cabin with a canvas bundle under one arm, the shape of a rifle pressing through the cloth. Behind him, Grace Turner poured hot water into a basin for Ranger, whose bandaged shoulder rose and fell with slow breaths. Lily knelt beside the dog, whispering softly, her small hands stroking the fur that had been shaved to clean the wound. Luke looked back once before descending the steps. "Keep the door locked," he said. "I'll be back before sundown." Grace wanted to stop him, but didn't. There was something in his face now, a resolve that made words useless. Ranger lifted his head, a low whine rising in his throat, but Luke only nodded to him. "You've done your part," he said. Then he turned toward the road, his boots crunching through the fresh crust of snow. The town lay quiet under the fading storm roofs, glinting with thin ice, the streets half buried and still. The sheriff's office sat on the edge of Main Street, a narrow building with paint peeling from its sign. Luke pushed through the door, the small bell above it chiming once. Sheriff Mason looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his tired eyes. "Luke," he said. "Didn't expect to see you so soon." Luke set the canvas bundle on the desk and unwrapped it with deliberate care. The metal of the rifle caught the light, clean, well-oiled military-issue serial numbers filed off. Mason's expression changed from curiosity to worry. "Where'd you get that?" he asked. "Dean's barn," Luke replied. "There's a dozen more like it under the tarp. He's running something bigger than pride, and you know it." Mason leaned back, his jaw working as if the words were hard to swallow. "Luke, you realize what you're saying. Those weapons aren't just his. There are men in this town who—" He stopped himself, glancing toward the window. Luke followed his gaze to the street outside, where two townsmen crossed toward the feed store, talking low, their eyes darting toward the office. "You're afraid of them," Luke said quietly. Mason sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm not afraid. I'm careful. This town's run on balance. Dean steps out of line. I can pull him back. But if you drag this into the open, it won't just be him that burns." Luke's tone stayed even. "The law doesn't work if you're scared to use it." Mason's eyes lifted to his. "And what if the law's already owned by the wrong men?" The silence stretched long between them. The ticking of the wall clock sounded louder than it should. Luke folded the cloth around the rifle again, his movements precise. "Then the law needs reminding of what it's for," he said. Mason rose from his chair, his voice heavy with warning. "Luke, you bring this into town and you'll start something you can't stop." Luke met his gaze without flinching. Maybe it started already. He turned and walked out before Mason could answer. The bell above the door jingled once, soft and final. The diner across the street was half full, the lunch crowd whispering over steaming cups. The moment Luke stepped inside the room quieted. Conversation faded into that uneasy silence that follows recognition. The same faces that once nodded politely now watched him with guarded eyes. Ranger wasn't there to lend his quiet strength, but Luke carried that steadiness in his posture. He walked to the counter and placed the rifle on it, the sound of metal on wood sharp enough to make the waitress flinch. This came from Dean Walker's barn. He said, his voice calm but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You all talk about law and what's right. This is what's wrong. You decide what to do with it." Ellis, the diner owner, wiped his hands on a towel, his eyes flicking between Luke and the weapon. "Luke," he said carefully, That's not something you should be waving around. Let the sheriff handle it. Luke's reply was steady. I did. He hesitated. A murmur rippled through the room. At one of the booths, a man in a heavy coat leaned forward. You're accusing half this town. Carter, he said. That's a bold move for someone living with another man's wife. Luke's gaze didn't waver. I'm not accusing anyone, he said. The truth doesn't need my help to speak. He picked up the rifle and set it upright against the counter, the barrel catching the afternoon light. If any of you still believe in the law, take this to Mason. If not, I'll take it myself. No one moved. The air thickened with shame and curiosity. The clatter of a dropped spoon echoed louder than it should have. Luke looked around the room, reading each face: the store clerk who owed Dean money, the ranch hand who feared losing his job, the teacher who lowered her eyes to avoid choosing sides. He saw it all, the fragile machinery of fear that kept decent people quiet. He spoke again, lower this time. A town that lets a man like Dean rule by fear isn't worth the dust on its road. Then he turned and walked out. Outside, the cold hit him like a wave. The wind had picked up again, stirring the snow in small spirals across the street. From somewhere behind him came the muted sound of voices rising, half in anger, half in defense. It didn't matter now. The truth was out. He walked back toward his truck, his boots leaving dark prints in the slush. When he opened the door, Ranger was waiting on the seat, eyes bright tail thumping once. You should have stayed home, Luke said quietly. Ranger leaned forward and pressed his nose against Luke's sleeve, his way of reminding him that solitude was a choice he no longer had to make. Luke drove to the edge of town, parking near the old bridge that crossed the creek. The water below ran dark and slow beneath its crust of ice. He stepped out, breathing in the cold, and leaned on the railing, thinking. Behind him, the faint echo of church bells carried on the wind, a Sunday sound on a weekday. It struck him that even faith like law was only as strong as the people who kept it. When he returned to the truck, he saw headlights in the distance, two sets moving slow, deliberate. He knew without guessing who they belonged to. He started the engine, not to run, but to prepare. The world had tilted toward confrontation, and there would be no turning it back. Ranger shifted to the window, ears pricked, body ready. Stay close, Luke said. The headlights drew nearer, gliding through the snow like eyes. Luke rested his hands on the wheel, steady as stone. The wind began to rise again that night, whispering through the pines like a warning. Luke Carter sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, though he hoped he would not need it. The flames painted the cabin walls with restless light, and the snow outside thickened until even the fence line disappeared. Grace Turner folded laundry in the corner. The small, repetitive motions a way to silence her worry, while Lily hummed softly beside Ranger, who lay with his head in her lap. Every few moments, the dog's ears flicked toward the window, the muscles beneath his fur tensing his nose, testing the air for scents that did not belong. Luke noticed, but said nothing. He trusted Ranger's instincts more than his own. By midnight, the storm was at full strength. The snow drove sideways, the wind shrieking against the shutters. Luke rose, checking the locks again, every sound from outside a possible threat. Ranger followed him to the door, tail-stiff eyes glowing in the firelight. Then came the sound, faint at first, then sharper. The crunch of boots on frozen ground. Luke's breath caught. Ranger's head snapped toward the noise, a growl rising from deep in his chest. Grace, Luke said quietly, "Wake Lily. Take her to the cellar." Grace looked at him, understanding immediately. She gathered the child and the oil lamp, pulling back the rug to reveal the trap door beneath. Lily clutched her mother's hand, confusion flickering into fear as Ranger nudged them toward safety. The dog barked once, short commanding, before turning toward the door again. The first gunshot shattered the night. Wood splintered near the window glass, spraying across the room. Luke dropped to one knee, dragging the rifle closer. Down he shouted, though Grace and Lily were already beneath the floor, the trap door sealed. Ranger barked furiously, his body positioned between the door and his master. A second shot followed, striking the door frame. Luke fired once, in return not to hit, but to warn. The echo disappeared into the storm. Then came the voices, 3 of them rough and close. "He's inside," one shouted. "Take him!" Another man cursed the wind for blinding him. Luke pressed his back to the wall, the rifle steady in his hands. Ranger moved to the window, teeth-bared tail stiff. A shadow passed outside the first man circling the porch. Luke waited until the figure neared the corner, then struck. The shot was clean, the muzzle flash brief. A body fell heavily into the snow. The other 2 returned fire blindly, bullets thudding against the logs. Ranger lunged toward the door, barking so fiercely the sound drowned the storm for an instant. Luke reloaded quickly, mind working cold and fast. "Stay close, boy," he whispered. The door shook as a boot struck it. Once, twice. The hinges groaned. When it finally burst inward, the wind and snow came with it, filling the room with swirling white. Dean Walker stood framed in the doorway, shotgun in hand, face contorted with rage and desperation. "You think you can take my family, Carter?" he shouted over the storm. Luke aimed but held his fire. "They're safe now, Dean. You can still walk away." Dean laughed, the sound brittle and wild. "Not without them." He raised the shotgun. Before he could pull the trigger, Ranger charged. The dog's body hit him square in the chest, the gun firing upward, the blast tearing into the ceiling. Dean stumbled backward, crashing against the porch rail. Luke moved fast, kicking the weapon aside. One of Dean's men appeared at the window shouting Ray, then froze when Luke's rifle turned toward him. The man hesitated, then fled into the snow, disappearing into the storm's blindness. The fight narrowed to 2. Dean swung his fist wildly, striking Luke's shoulder. The Marine took the hit, countering with calm precision, using his weight to disarm without killing. They grappled in the snow-choked doorway, the cold biting through their coats, each breath a ghost in the storm. Then, from behind, came a cry. Lily's voice. She had climbed from the cellar, drawn by the chaos. "Mama," she called. At that same moment, Dean broke free, snatching a pistol from his belt. Luke turned, but the shot came too fast. Ranger moved first, throwing his body in front of the child as the bullet tore through the wooden frame and struck him in the side. The dog yelped once, then fell heavily against the floor. Lily screamed, dropping beside him. Luke's vision tunneled. He lunged at Dean, wrenching the pistol from his hand and driving him backward through the open doorway. They fell into the snow, the storm swallowing them. Luke pinned Dean, the rifle pressed against his throat, but something inside him stopped the pull of the trigger. The memory of other faces, enemy and friend alike, rose through the haze. Killing him would not end, this only begin it again. He released the pressure, grabbed Dean by the collar and hauled him to his feet. "You're finished," he said through clenched teeth. Dean tried to fight, but exhaustion and cold had already taken his strength. By dawn, the storm had broken. The sky glowed faintly pink over the valley as Luke trudged down the road toward town, dragging Dean behind him through the snow. The man's protests were hoarse, swallowed by wind. Luke said nothing. His face was streaked with blood that wasn't all his. When they reached Main Street, the first lights flickered on in shop windows. Sheriff Mason stepped onto the porch of his office, his eyes widening at the sight. "Luke," he began, but Luke cut him off with a motion of his hand. He dropped Dean into the snow at Mason's feet. "He came for them," Luke said quietly. "Now you do your job." Mason bent to cuff the groaning man, his expression a mixture of relief and regret. "You should have killed him," Dean spat, voice raw. Luke looked down at him, his tone cold but steady. "The war's over, Dean. You just never learned how to stop fighting." He turned then, walking back toward the truck where Ranger waited. Grace and Lily had followed the trail from the cabin, their faces pale with fear and frost. When Lily saw Ranger lying still in the truck bed, she ran forward, sobbing. The dog opened one eye tail, flicking weakly. Luke placed a hand on her shoulder. "He'll make it," he said, though the words were half a prayer. The sun climbed higher, its light stretching across the snow, touching the rifle in Mason's hands, the broken man at his feet, and the blood-stained prints leading back toward the hills. In that quiet hour, nothing moved but the smoke from the sheriff's stove and the slow rise and fall of Ranger's chest. For the first time in years, Luke felt something close to peace, not the loud kind, won by force, but the quiet one earned through endurance. He lifted Lily into his arms and turned toward home. Behind him, the town stirred awake, whispering of what had happened. But for Luke, the sound meant little now. The storm had passed, and those who survived had to decide what kind of silence they would keep. The snow melted slowly that week, leaving behind a world bruised and quiet. The valley smelled of damp wood and smoke, and the town that had once whispered now spoke in cautious tones. Dean Walker sat behind bars awaiting trial, his name now a curse even among those who had once nodded to him at church. Sheriff Mason spent long hours writing reports beneath the dim light of his desk lamp, his conscience finally catching up to his duty. He had testified to the truth about the rifles, about the violence, about how close their small town had come to tearing itself apart. The law would move slow, but it would move. Yet for Luke Carter, there was no victory in it. He stood by the fence of his cabin at dawn, staring out across the thawing fields, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Behind him, the roof still bore scars from gunfire, the wood patched, but never the same. Inside Grace, Turner folded clothes into a suitcase, her movements quiet, deliberate, her face pale from sleepless nights. Lily helped her arranging Ranger's bandages with the careful precision of a child trying to heal what the world had hurt. Luke turned as Mason's truck rolled up the lane, tires crunching the frost. The sheriff stepped out slowly, hat in hand. "The investigation's done," he said. "The evidence you brought, it broke the whole thing open." He hesitated before adding, "Some folks think you went too far." Luke nodded once. "And others think I didn't go far enough." Mason sighed. "Truth is, they'll talk no matter what. People don't like seeing their peace disturbed, even when that peace was built on silence." His voice softened. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Luke looked toward the barn where his old truck waited half-packed. "There's nothing left to keep me here," he said. "The land will sell to the Callahans." They wanted the pasture anyway. Mason shifted his weight. "You saved lives, Luke. That should count for something." Luke's reply was quiet but firm. "It counts to me." "That's enough." The sheriff nodded, understanding the kind of peace a man like Luke sought, one that came only with distance. By noon, word had spread that Luke Carter was leaving. Some watched from porches as he loaded his tools into the truck, their faces half hidden behind curtains. The same people who once accepted his silence now whispered it was dangerous. Grace stood on the porch holding Lily's hand. She wanted to speak, to ask him to stay, but knew the wound between them was the town itself. "You could start over here," she said finally. "With time, they'd see." Luke shook his head gently. "Time doesn't fix what fear teaches people to believe. You and Lily will have your peace now. That's what matters." Ranger limped to his side, bandaged but alert, his eyes tracking every motion. Luke placed a hand on his head. "You ready?" The dog's tail swept once against the step. When the last box was loaded, Luke closed the tailgate, the sound echoing against the barn walls. Grace stepped closer. "You never asked for any of this," she said, "but you gave us our lives back." Luke met her gaze, the faintest smile breaking through the weariness. "Then that's enough for me." She hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pressed something into his hand, a small folded piece of paper. "It's the letter I wrote years ago," she said. The one I sent to a Marine overseas. I never thought it found you. Luke unfolded it, recognizing the faded handwriting. The words were simple, a few lines of encouragement written by a stranger during a war that felt endless. He looked at her realization settling between them. It found me when I needed it most, he said quietly. And so did you. Lily stood by the steps, her eyes bright with tears she tried to hide. You're really going? She asked. Luke crouched to her height, his voice gentle. For now, he said, but you've got Ranger to look after, and he'll keep you safe. The child shook her head. He's yours. Luke smiled faintly. He was never mine. He just goes where he's needed. Ranger whined, as if understanding, pressing his nose against Lily's hand before returning to Luke's side. Take care of your mama, Luke said. Lily nodded solemnly, then straightened, raising her small hand in a salute she had practiced in secret. Goodbye, Sergeant Carter. The formality in her voice wavered with emotion, and her tears froze on her cheeks in the cold air. Luke's chest tightened. He returned the salute slowly, the gesture heavy with everything he could not say. He climbed into the truck, Ranger beside him, the dog's head resting on his knee. The engine sputtered, coughed, then caught. Grace and Lily stood together as the truck began to roll down the dirt road, the snow crunching beneath the tires. Luke looked once in the mirror, the cabin shrinking, the figures framed by the light spilling from the open door. Lily's hand still held its salute unwavering until the curve in the road took them from sight. The valley stretched ahead wide and open, the kind of space where silence no longer felt like punishment. Ranger shifted, laying his head fully in Luke's lap, his eyes half closed. Rest easy, soldier, Luke said softly. The dog's tail thumped once, a quiet answer. The road wound through the last stretch of pine forest before merging with the highway. As the truck climbed the ridge, sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the snow. Luke slowed, looking back one last time at the town below a place he had defended but could no longer call home. He thought of the words Grace had written years ago. The world may forget your name, but not the peace you fought for. For a long moment he let the stillness settle. The war he had carried inside finally felt distant, not gone, but quieter. The kind of quiet earned, not given. He reached over, scratched behind Ranger's ear, and whispered, We made it home, didn't we? The dog's eyes met his steady and knowing. The highway stretched ahead, endless and bright. Luke pressed the gas, the truck rolling forward into the morning light. Behind them, the cabin smoke rose straight into the sky, thin and calm, like the end of a prayer. Before you go, tell me what you think. Would you have opened that door for a stranger in the middle of a storm? What part of Luke Ranger or little Lily stayed with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially where you're watching from. Every story hits different depending on where you call home. If you felt something in this story, the silence, the fight, the loyalty, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the next story, Waiting Just Beyond the Snow.